Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar hosted by CND and Drone Wars UK. We're going to be examining the UK's militarisation of space, how we got here and how the peace movement should respond. Although the UK space programme began in 1952, until recently it has had very limited impact. However, as the commercial space sector has expanded and the cost of launches has decreased, the UK government is now treating space as an area of serious interest. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the setting up of UK Space Command, the publication of a defence space strategy outlining how the Ministry of Defence will, quotes, protect the UK's national interests in space, and the announcement of a portfolio of programmes for developing space assets and infrastructure. Currently, the MOD is planning its first space launch from the UK. So, a very fascinating and important subject, and we're very fortunate to have a really expert panel this evening. They will speak for around about 10 minutes each, and then we'll move to questions and answers. So please do use the Q&A box below your screen, and we'll come to that after the introductions. So first of all, we'll turn to Dave Webb. Dave was Professor of Engineering at Leeds Beckett University, where he was instrumental in helping to found, develop and teach peace and conflict studies. He is former Chair of CND, a member of the Drone Wars UK Steering Committee, and co-author of the new report, For Heaven's Sake, examining the UK's militarisation of space. He's a member of the board of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and a patron of Scientists for Global Responsibility. Dave, thank you for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's good to be here. And I'll just share the screen if I can. Hang on, sorry. I think this is the right one. Can you see that? Okay.
That's fine, Dave.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. So, as you say, Kate, although the UK space programme started as long ago as 1952, it sort of fizzled out without really achieving much at all. So why has it suddenly become so important now? Well, space business has become big business, and it looks set to become a $1 trillion industry by 2040. These are some of the applications, the commercial applications of space that you can see on here. And the commercial space sector has expanded, and as you said, the cost of satellite production and launches has decreased, and the military has now also become dependent on satellites for communication, for surveillance, intelligence gathering, and wide area command and control. And the UK is taking space very seriously from both the commercial and military viewpoints. It believes it offers financial benefits and international kudos. In terms of the military, the annual MOD report for 2020 to 2021 included the following statement. Space is fundamental to military operations and underpins our ability to undertake the majority of defence tasks. And the UK's military plans for space have been outlined in 3 documents, as I think you mentioned earlier, Kate. The Integrated Review of Security and Defence was issued in March last year, and a fairly large part of it was devoted to military space activities. The National Space Strategy followed in September and was aimed at developing the space economy and protecting the UK's interests in space. Then in February this year, the MOD published its Defence Space Strategy, which indicated how defence will protect the UK's national interests in space in an era of ever-growing threats. The strategy included a portfolio of programmes for developing space assets and allocated some £6.4 billion over the next 10 years for various space programmes. And these included the upgrading of Skynet, which is the UK's military communications satellite network, the development of a network of small satellites for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance and target selection, for developing and enhancing command and control of space assets, and the development of space domain awareness capabilities for detecting, tracking and identifying objects in orbit. So the government clearly believes that space is crucial for military operations, and the Ministry of Defence has now a Space Directorate, which works closely with the UK Space Agency and is responsible for military space policy. And the UK Space Command was established in April last year to oversee the military space programme. But the UK cannot work alone on space projects that involve global coverage. And not surprisingly, the MOD works closely with the US Space Command and the US Space Force. And the US Space Force has established Operation Olympic Defender to build international partnerships to deter adversaries and hostile acts in space. And the UK was the first to join in 2019. Last April, the US and UK Space Commands together signed an Enhanced Space Cooperation Memorandum of Understanding, a framework for deeper military cooperation in space. It calls for exchanging more information, harmonising military space requirements, and identifying potential joint activities. The UK is also part of a combined space operations initiative. There we go. Alongside Australia, Canada, France, Germany, New Zealand, and the US. And it also is represented at the NATO Space Centre in Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The military space business is extremely expensive. And so the government is also looking to share the cost with business by encouraging joint dual use programs. UK Space is the trade association of the British space industry, and the RAF has established a commercial integration cell at the MOD Space Operations Centre in High Wycombe to work on programs that are common to commercial and military interests. The RAF has also seconded personnel to commercial sector operators such as Surrey Satellite Technology Limited and Virgin Orbit to help gain further insight into space operations and to influence future developments. The UK wants to be the first country in Europe to launch a satellite from home soil, and to help achieve this, it's awarded grants totaling nearly £40 million to develop a number of spaceports around the UK. Some are for vertical ground launches and others are for horizontal air launches, which launch rockets from carrier aircraft, from taking off from normal kinds of airfields. The UK Space Agency currently supports the development of 3 of these proposed 7 sites that you see here. They are the Saxe-Voord spaceport, which was previously the Shetland Space Centre on the Isle of Unst in the Shetland Islands, Space Hub Sutherland in Sutherland County in northern Scotland, and Spaceport Cornwall in Newquay Airport in Cornwall. Other spaceports and space centres are also being supported by the government, all involving the military, industry, commerce, and/or academia. To support these activities, a consortium of local enterprise partnerships are involved in establishing a series of regional space hubs to ensure space is as a commercial priority. And of course, arms companies such as Leonardo, Raytheon, BAE Systems are involved. Lockheed Martin is developing a space centre at Saxe-Voord, as we've mentioned, in the Shetlands for vertical launch operations, and is planning the first small satellite launch from the UK probably next year. Virgin Orbit is also planning to use Spaceport Cornwall for horizontal launches for a Welsh startup company, maybe this year or next. Although many of these launches may be for commercial companies, Alexandra Stickings, a space analyst at the Royal United Services Institute in London, believes that the Shetlands and Sutherland spaceports at least will need military contracts to be viable. I am of the opinion, she says, that the proposed spaceports would need the MOD as a customer to survive, as well as securing contracts with companies such as Lockheed. And the military will want to diversify their launch capabilities. So the Scottish locations could provide an option for certain future missions. She also warned that there is also a possibility that if these sites become a reality, there will be pressure on the MOD to support them, even if the cost is more than for other providers. There has been opposition to the Scottish spaceports from local residents and environmental groups, but planning permission has been granted regardless. Communities in the US have had similar experiences and offer some examples of what has happened to them. People living close to the spaceport on Kodiak Island in Alaska, which you can see here, have told us, we were promised many jobs. We were told that local residents would be trained to assemble satellites and there will be all sorts of other jobs. But there's been less than 15 jobs out there now. They were told that commercial companies were lining up to launch their satellites, but none of these ever materialized. Recent research is also showing that the launching of rockets is producing environmental problems, polluting the ground and the atmosphere with fuel and exhaust fumes. Considerable amounts of CO2 are also released by the development and manufacture of rockets and from producing, storing and burning rocket fuels. We need far more understanding of the environmental effects and more care to be taken. But there's no agreement so far on what constitutes responsible behaviour with regards to humanity's presence in space. And the field of space ethics needs further urgent work. Ground rules need to be established before the commercial and military exploitation of space moves ahead without regard to environmental and ethical factors. Finally, to address some of the gaps in current space policy, our report makes the following recommendations. Oh, should make the following. Can you still see that? Yeah, okay, sorry. I've gone beyond. Here we go. More public discussion and debate about the use of space and its benefits and downsides. In particular, the UK Space Agency and the Ministry of Defence should develop codes of good ethical practice and their space operations and associated ground-based developments. More research into the environmental effects of space operations, both short and long term on Earth and in space, is needed. The UK Space Agency should not provide funding or support for projects where high ethical and environmental risks can be foreseen. Meaningful environmental impact assessments, including the impacts on space, should be conducted before the development of spaceports. And the UK government should continue work internationally to promote reasonable, responsible behaviour in space, whilst ensuring its own conduct in space is beyond reproach. I would suggest that I urge you really to download a copy of the report from the CND and Drone Wars UK websites and have a closer look through. I've only really skimmed through the major points of the report here. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Dave. That was absolutely fascinating. And of course, there will be the recording of this evening's webinar, which will include these going on the CND website and no doubt the Drone Wars UK website too. So there'll be lots of opportunities to revisit all this amazing information and rather worrying information, I should say, as well. So thanks very much, Dave. And now we turn to our next speaker, Dr. Jill Stewart. Jill is an academic based at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's an expert in the politics, ethics and law of outer space exploration and exploitation, and she's a regular commentator on the issue in the media. For 5 years, she was editor-in-chief of Space Policy Journal and remains on the board. In 2015, she was awarded the prestigious Margaret Mead Lecture Award by the British Science Association in recognition of her cutting-edge research in this area. Jill, it's a real pleasure to have you with us this evening. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And really, no, it's my pleasure. As you can tell from my accent, I'm an immigrant, but I've certainly seen the CND posters on marches that I've been on and so on. And when I told my partner that I was going to be speaking at an event hosted by you guys, he's British, and he was, very enthusiastic because I know you have a really important historical heritage here, and I appreciate that. So it's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I was trying to think about what I could say, especially knowing that I'd be following Dave. And I knew that Dave would have a really comprehensive and useful overview of this. So I thought I would sort of stick with what I do, which is space law, and talk a little bit about the sort of ethical and legal issues around this area. And also just to highlight that, to me, a lot of what I've been thinking about recently is the environmental impact. So in addition to talking about military aspects, I'm going to be talking about environmental aspects. So I just want to say there has been very much a renewed interest in space activity for the UK. And I think that this is not surprising, considering, as Dave pointed out, that this is a very big industry now. There's a lot of money to be made in space, and the UK sees themselves as being having the potential to position themselves strategically within that larger market. And in that sense, when we talk about moving forward, I don't like to say that any sort of space activity is inevitable. I don't believe in technological determinism. And I think that that's something that comes up a lot when you do space research, is people kind of saying, well, it's going to happen anyway. And I don't believe in that. I think that there should always be conversation and the possibility for resistance. But as I have on my screen, having said that, there obviously is a big momentum around space activity. And so I don't think that we should be looking at necessarily stifling it, but really looking at continuing conversations and thinking about how to proceed responsibly. I also just wanted to highlight that I think it isn't right now, I think it's good that there's, I'm seeing more of a narrative, particularly from younger generations. I do a lot of public speaking about environmental impacts, because I think they've been raised with this, and there is this sense of, well, what is this going to be doing, not only to our environment on Earth, but our environment in space. When I first started researching this topic 20 years ago, people didn't really have any thoughts about space debris or the fact that we're creating this orbiting, junk field. And people are increasingly aware of that. But I also want to highlight that space has also been very good for our awareness around the environment. I mean, we tend to associate the momentum behind the environmental movement, particularly in the 70s, as being linked to having images of Earth from space and being able to see it as this sort of fragile, interconnected environment. And then also in really practical ways of being able to monitor Earth from space, being able to monitor, the ozone hole, and I also do some work in human rights, being able to monitor, things like migration. And so I think there is this sort of potential feedback loop, and there can be a positive element to that. So I don't want to say that that space is, purely a negative in terms of the overall picture here. And what I think is interesting, I have on the screen here, is environmentalism sort of out and in. So when we started the space age, we thought we were looking out, but a lot of what we did was actually end up looking back in at our own environment and our politics and our humanity and the ecosystem as a whole. And then there's also this link, of course, between space and security. So one of the things when I do speak, people who are in this really sort of space scientists, I think we'd like to see space as having this narrative of being for really noble purposes and scientific purposes. But in reality, I tend to highlight that the origins of space activity was very much in military competition with the first space race. And, that's where the money tends to come in when we have space activity, or at least it has in the past. So we can't ignore this link between space and security and the military industrial complex and so on. I mean, space is, as Dave highlighted, you know, what we call a force multiplier with regards to the theater of war, and that militaries use it to enhance their own capabilities. And the other big issue here is dual use technology. So pretty much everything that goes up into space could be used for either peaceful purposes or military purposes. You know, the satellites that we've used to monitor human migration, for example, in terms of potential human rights abuses, it can also be used to monitor troop movement by the military. So there is this really complicated relationship between the two. And the report also used the word fuzzy, which I like. So there's this increasingly fuzzy relationship, I think, between military and commercial entities. That's always been there, but as there's an increase in commercial activity in space, we're seeing that in my own research, I sometimes call it the hybridization of entities. So we're seeing this kind of complicated mixing between entities. I highlight that because I think when we think of space, people tend to think, you know, satellites, for example, you know, science, commercial, military, but it's much messier than that. The funding is messier, you know, public-private partnerships and so on. And so it makes it more difficult to think ethically, politically, and legally about these issues. So now I just want to briefly go through the legal background so that we have that. I mean, I know we're talking now about needing sort of more regulation and sort of ground guidance, but in reality, I want us to not forget that there is a pre-existing strong legal infrastructure for the governance of outer space. The main one of those is the Outer Space Treaty, which was passed in 1967, and it says, amongst other things, that space should be for peaceful purposes, and it bans the weapons of mass destruction in space. The problem with peaceful purposes is that it doesn't ban militarization, but again, it would be really complicated to do so because of the dual use nature of technology that's up there. But it kind of puts forward this intention of space being for peaceful purposes. As a side note, kind of the pessimist in me has to highlight that the reason that came about is because the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to lock each other out of doing nuclear tests in outer space at that time, because they felt that they couldn't control the other. So it was a strategic military decision to use the language of peaceful purposes. But nonetheless, it's there, and it now forms, it's sometimes called the Constitution of Outer Space because it's widely respected. After that, we had the Liability Convention in 1972, which said that any damage that's caused by a space object, either in space or on Earth, is the responsibility of the launching country. So, and what's interesting is commercial entities, for example, what would be using UK spaceports, let's say it's a private company, but they will still have to be registered with a launching country, and it, in many cases, would be the UK. And so the UK would be responsible for damage caused in space or on Earth by an object that was launched from space territory. It's not entirely the case. Sometimes if it's a German company or something like that, then they will ask Germany to be the responsible chain in that liability chain. But oftentimes it's the country that the object was launched from. And the registration convention just says that everything that goes up into outer space has to be registered so that we know who's responsible for what up there. The truth is that countries tend to be a bit vague about the purpose of the objects that are up there, again, because of the dual use nature of them. I would also just highlight in terms of environment that we also have voluntary guidelines produced by COSPAR, so the Committee on Space Research. They're an organization, and a lot of countries have signed up to what they have asked sort of responsible entities to adhere to when doing space activity. And one of the key phrases that they use a lot is planetary protection. What's interesting is they don't just mean our planet, they mean other planets as well. So there are guidelines about what we need to do for space objects before they get launched into outer space so that we're not contaminating other environments, and then also when objects return from space, what we need to do in order to protect the space environment from anything that's potentially brought back from space. So there are both sort of binding regulations and also voluntary regulations. I say binding. International law is notoriously difficult to enforce, but the Outer Space Treaty, for example, has been ratified by most countries in the world. Whether or not they actually adhere to it or they bend the rules sometimes, they at least outwardly have stated that they have signed up to that background framework. In terms of the UK, with regards to spaceports, we have the Space Industry Act of 2008 and the Space Industry Regulations, and they have been laid out to do a few things. For one, if you're going to operate a spaceport, you have to have a Civil Aviation Authority license, and they also are requiring an assessment of environmental effects. One of the things when I was reading that struck me is that it did seem to put a lot of onus on the individual companies as to sort of what they were looking for within that. But there are discussions that are ongoing about this. So that was sort of just a sweeping overview of all of that. And I really liked in the report some of the recommendations that were made. And I would just echo that I think one of the things we definitely need is public discussion and an informed public, and for people to feel empowered to have a say in what's happening and to be involved. Also, I do space law, so maybe it's inevitable that I'm going to suggest that we do need regulatory oversight. In some ways, I know that that can empower government in some ways, but I think that it's better to have a sense of that we are monitoring what's going on and that there are restrictions upon it, but without getting to the point that they are antagonistic to business, because I think that we need to have this continue to be ideally a relationship where where the entities that actually have the ability to reach space are also invested in adhering to the rules, norms, and principles that we have in place for space activity. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much indeed, Jill. Amazing. I didn't even really know there was an arena of space law, so that's really really very interesting, and I'm going to make myself knowledgeable about that in future. So now to our third speaker. It's a great pleasure to welcome Bruce Gagnon. Bruce is co-founder and coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He has worked to oppose the militarisation of space for more than 35 years, writing, speaking and appearing in the media on the issue numerous times. Bruce writes a regular blog called Organising Notes, which examines the US military and economic empire, and he's also an active member of Veterans for Peace. Bruce, we're delighted and honoured to have you with us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Good evening to everyone. I'm glad to be here with you. I want to say that I think this study, which I've read now a couple times, for heaven's sake, is really well done, and I congratulate everyone that worked on it. I think it's really, really important, and this discussion obviously as well. I want to talk a little bit about this planning document called Vision for 2020, put out by the United States Space Command in 1997. And in there, they talk about how the United States will control and dominate space, and during times of crisis, deny other nations access to space, which obviously is quite provocative. In there, they also talk about global engagement and global partnerships. Global engagement being the ability to see everything on the planet, to intercept all communications, to hear everything on the planet, and ultimately target every place on the planet. And in order to do that, they say, because it's such an expensive process, years ago in one of the industry publications, they called Star Wars, this generic name for war in space, the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And they say we can't afford it in the United States ourselves. So we've got to, number one, get rid of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net. This was said in an editorial in the industry publication called Space News some years ago. And then finally, they need these global partnerships. And so what is being spelled out in this, this study is just one example of one of these global partnerships where the United States is reaching out to its allies, getting them involved in the program, with the US basically in control of the tip of the spear. So the US intends to use this for global domination. Right now, there's an explosion, literal explosion of launch sites being proposed and developed in the United States and around the world. I just want to give 3 examples. Dave very briefly talked about Kodiak Island, Alaska, but the people there were promised that it would be only for civilian launches. And now, after all these years, more than 20 years, the only thing that has ever been launched from this place are basically Star Wars tests, predominantly so-called missile defense system tests. Another one is Rocket Lab in New Zealand, built in a indigenous land controlled by the indigenous people, and they were promised when the Rocket Lab people went to them that it would only be for civilian purposes, for studying the Earth and climate and et cetera, et cetera. And so far, every launch has been done for military purposes. In fact, Lockheed Martin has now taken over the running of Rocket Lab, and inside of the facility, you see 2 flags hanging on the wall. One is the New Zealand flag, and the other is the American flag. And here in my own state of Maine, our state government recently passed a law allowing the creation of an aerospace corporate state-funded infrastructure, and that with the capacity to build 2 or 3 launch sites. And they promised that it would be for civilian only. They promised it would only use non-toxic fuels, if there is such a thing, that it would have no environmental impact whatsoever, that it would create massive numbers of jobs in the aerospace sector. And then we found out that one of the leading proponents of this is a Maine company that already has funding from the Department of Defense to test hypersonic missiles for the Pentagon. So across the world, then, there's this growing reality that more and more launch sites are being proposed. Now, why is that? I think one reason is redundancy. In order to have a successful, what they have described repeatedly in the Pentagon, first strike capability, they need redundancy. They need to make sure that in time of war, when countries start taking out or disabling or blowing up each other's satellites, that they have satellite redundancy, that they have extra capacity. Secondly, well, just as an aside to that, on page 13 in the study, you acknowledge that the United States has been working with the British Air Force to create anti-satellite capability on British warplanes that would be able to take off from any base and then fire anti-satellite weapons into space to knock out other countries' satellites. So this is just one example of this first strike capability being talked about inside of this study here. The other reason I think for this explosion of launch sites is because we're increasingly hearing of crowded orbits. There's a lot of space debris orbiting the planet that is increasingly becoming problematic. NASA and other agencies fear the so-called Kessler Syndrome. That's K-E-S-S-L-E-R, Kessler Syndrome. The idea is that at some point, there'll be so much space debris up there that there'll be this cascading collision, everything crashing into each other, creating more and more and more as you go along. And at that point, guess what? Everything on the planet virtually goes dark. In fact, in 1989, I organized a protest at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and our speaker that day was Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell, one of the early moonwalkers. And he said, if we ever have a war in space, it will be the one and the only, because we'll create so much space debris that we'll have a orbiting minefield, he called it, around the planet, that we would not be able to get a rocket through the planet Earth. So because of this growing reality of crowded orbits, it's like a parking lot at a supermarket. It's becoming crowded. There are very few parking spaces left. And so what I think is happening is the United States and its allies want to fill up these parking spaces as soon as possible to keep out other countries who might be competitors. Because remember, with space technology in place, whether it's so-called civilian or military, or increasingly dual use, where it's both civilian and military at the same time, whoever controls the orbits, controls the satellite placements, they then have an advantage in the event of any wars in the future. Ozone depletion is a huge problem as we have this increase of launches of satellites. Elon Musk is asking for permission from the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission that regulates launches in the United States. He's asking for permission to launch tens of thousands of satellites, predominantly for 5G. They want to have a satellite over the head of every single person on the planet every minute of the day. And as it turns out, we're finding out that 5G also has military implications. In fact, Elon Musk has been supplying the Ukrainian government with 5G surveillance technology of Russia in the current war that's going on. So again, large danger zones to be aware of. Also, to pick up on the Outer Space Treaty and space law, the Outer Space Treaty did in fact ban weapons of mass destruction. But some years ago, I was reading an article in Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine, where they were reporting on an annual war game that the Pentagon has, computer war game, called the Red Team versus the Blue Team. And in that war game, the United States launched a first strike attack on Russia and China. And they had a lawyer next to them sitting at a military lawyer sitting at the computer console. And they said, can we use this military space plane, the X-33 or 37, I forgot which it is now. Can we use that to drop down from space, drop an attack as part of this war game? And he said, yes, you can. And they said, it won't violate the Outer Space Treaty, a weapon of mass destruction. And he said, no, because it's a weapon of selective destruction. And because of that legal wormhole, if you will, there's a great need for a new treaty. And for many years, both Russia and China have been introducing at the United Nations a treaty called PAROS, P-A-R-O-S, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space.
You've had 10 minutes, Bruce.
Okay, I'm about a minute shy, so let me just wrap it up. So at this, at the UN every year, Russia and China have been blocking the development of this treaty. And finally, the nuclear industry views space as a new market for mining colonies on the moon and Mars and other planetary surfaces. And soon they're going to be testing a nuclear rocket with nuclear reactors for engines in what's called lower Earth orbit, just above our head. Normally they would test the engines on the ground, but they don't want to have to go through the environmental regulations that would be necessary to do so. So there's no environmental regulations if they test these nuclear reactor engines just over our heads. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Bruce. That's brilliant. And we've got questions now, so there'll be opportunities for our speakers to share more of their knowledge. So I'm going to put a few questions. Some of them are, you're all welcome to answer them. They're important questions, and then some that are more specific for each of you. So I'll read them out and then give you the opportunity to reply in the same order. And then depending on how long you take, we'll either have more questions or we'll wrap up. So first of all, how can we best protest against the first space launch from Newquay in Cornwall? And maybe you could elaborate more widely as well beyond Newquay. How can we campaign generally against them? And then we are already in an environmental and climate emergency. What will be the effect on the climate and environment of the Earth from all this space activity? And then one that's more specifically for Jill. Bruce talks about the promises that sites, quotes, would only be used for civilian purposes, etc. Does Jill know of legal frameworks that have been developed to prevent the abuses that Bruce has spoken of? And then for Dave specifically, is the UK involved in any developments of space weapons or anti-satellite systems? And then for Bruce, what do you see as the major threats to keeping space for peace in the near future? Okay, so quite a bit to be going on with there. Dave, over to you first of all.
Okay, thanks. Let's take the question about what can we do about Newquay in Cornwall. I think Jill mentioned that spaceports have to get permission really from the UK Civil Aviation Authority, and unfortunately they've had a public consultation on the assessment of environmental effects for Virgin Orbit and Spaceport Cornwall, but the closing date for that was just a few days ago, the 19th. So there isn't anything. Well, I mean, you could still perhaps write in, but I don't know whether any notice will be taken about it. And this is for the environmental effects, possible environmental effects from the spaceport. But the Virgin have only, I think they're requesting something like 3 launches a year, something like that. I think it would be a good idea to try to do something about, well, try to protest, make sure that it's clear that you object to these launches, either write to Virgin Orbit or the Civil Aviation Authority, or just be there with banners and so on. It's quite difficult to know what else you can do under these circumstances, but the more letter writing and the more presence that you can show, I think, is the better. And that goes for any of these space hubs, especially when you can actually say that they're going to be for military use, which, as Bruce has outlined, is almost certainly the case for all of them, probably. So just the environmental question and climate emergency, Bruce already outlined that the effects of these launches have on space and on the local environment. It's a kind of a mixture of various effects. For example, one of the space ports in Scotland requires that they dig up a whole load of peat bogs. They basically take the peat away, and that will release a huge amount of methane into the atmosphere. And there were protests about this, environmental protests, but the spaceport company said, oh no, we've got a way of dealing with that, without really clarifying what that is or how they're going to do that. Also, the rockets themselves, as they're kind of traveling through space, they deposit carbon deposits, lunar deposits, which affect the ozone layer and cause an acceleration, really, of climate change problems. And again, I think not enough is known exactly about how much of this is happening for each launch, but it needs to be really more work done. Just one final thing on that. Although it's claimed that things are carbon neutral, nothing is ever carbon neutral if it's produced, if it's built, if it's manufactured, and it always produces carbon dioxide in the manufacturing process. And also I think there are some fuels that are claimed to be organic and carbon free, but if you look at the way that the materials are grown, for the organic materials to produce the fuel, they require a lot of fertilizers, which are very harmful to the ground. And so there's kind of effects, and a chain reaction of effects all the way through this process, which really need far more consideration, far more understanding, and far more openness for people to really know what's going on. There was another question you said from, oh, I think Bruce already said about the anti-satellite systems. The United States is helping to train UK pilots, as Bruce said, to enhance their kind of aircraft with ASAT, anti-satellite weapons technologies, and they have to take the aircraft vertically up, extremely high, very vertical kind of trajectories, fire the rocket so that it can hit the satellite and then make their way back down again. So they're being trained by American pilots at the moment, or have been. It's been reported, I think, in the Daily Express, that beacon of truth and justice. So I think better move on to somebody else now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dave. Jill, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks for the good questions. One of the reasons I really like public engagement is you get asked stuff that forces you to think about things you might not. You get stuck in your own research ruts, and it's good for me. With regards to potential legal regulatory frameworks to counter what Bruce said about spaceports potentially being for civilian purposes only, I'm sorry to say this, but no, I don't know of any. There's a handful of reasons for that. And I don't want to sound like I'm just batting this back like it can't be done, but it's better to be informed about what the challenges are. So these are the challenges. For one is how we define civilian. Civilian activity, okay, not military. Does that also mean then that it can't be funded in any way by government? So much anymore has this hybrid model of funding and activity. So I think there's a tricky issue there to be got around. The second issue is the control of information that we get from space activity. So let's say we have what's purely a civilian launch. It's a private company. It has no government funding and it has no military purposes. Let's say their purpose is to monitor the Earth environment for the rise of sea levels, let's say, which is something that we definitely use satellites for. It would be sort of in the interest of the scientific community to be transparent and release those images. What if those images are then used by, a government military for, maritime military purposes? Again, I'm not saying that's a reason in itself to avoid this, but just, we have to think about the implications of how this would become codified. So yeah, it's really difficult because we gather a lot of information from space, and who controls that information, particularly when I think it kind of crosses our purposes where we want transparency. So if we release this information, then we have to accept that it could fall into it could be used by a lot of different types of entities, and what do we do about that? And the third issue that ties into all of this is, again, the dual use nature of space. So let's say, a civilian communications satellite network, if a military chooses to pay to use that service, then does it stop being civilian? So there's a lot of legal complications that around how that would actually sort of be written up. I'm actually going to dovetail back onto this at the end so I'm going to move on to the next question, but I am going to come back to this issue at the very end. The next question about the environmental, absolutely. What are the key issues? Dave mentioned the carbon impact of rockets and, just rocket fuel and launching things into space. I think we also need to think about debris on Earth, the potential damage caused by crashes on Earth, or, for example, rockets falling back to Earth if they aren't the kind that can return. And then also debris in space, the cloud around Earth. But I would also add a fourth issue, which is sort of outside of the remit of this discussion, but also I have concerns ethically and environmentally about the impact that we're potentially having on deeper Earth environments. So as we talk about exploring and potentially, colonizing is perhaps the best word, but inhabiting other space environments, what our moral obligations are in those circumstances. And I think a lot of those are around environment. Is something that I do talk about with regards to what the environment is and what our ethical responsibilities are in that case. I also do work in the area of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, so there's a lot in that area as well. So those are sort of the key issues, but I would like to highlight again that I think that we can't see space activity as sort of this homogeneous block of things that we should be concerned about. Again, a lot of space activity has helped us. That we do, awareness that we have can be attributed to the scientific information that we're able to gather from space. So I don't think we can just lump all space activity into one category as being something that we should necessarily curb. But having said that, of course, the concern is that the amount of space activity has increased so dramatically recently. And sorry, I'm realizing that I'm talking on. I'll be quick here.
No, that's fine.
Okay, I just don't want to cut off. I don't want to cut off Bruce. Again, we should, be aware, but I do want to give a few reasons for optimism. I mean, there are some positive developments. A lot of the satellites that we put up now have to have end of life plans so that basically they deorbit themselves once they're no longer of use. So the debris issue, it is growing, but not nearly as exponentially as it was before we started to develop these technologies. A lot of that actually is really boring, but has to do with insurance. So any object that gets put into space now has to have a really hefty insurance coverage. And because if it causes damage, then there's a big bill that comes with it because of the registration and liability conventions. And so companies, for selfish reasons, but have become more, and governments have become more interested in figuring out ways to deorbit their materials that are up there. Yeah, there are, and again, just general, I think, awareness around environmental activities. What I wanted to say that I think I would also link back to the first question about regulating for, potentially requiring a lockdown on this has to be for civilian purposes, which I think is probably not possible. In all of my research, one thing that I found, which I know sounds a little bit maybe naive, but I have found genuine reasons to believe that both companies and governments have an interest in being seen as legitimate and preserving their reputation. And so one thing that I think can be done, again, things like protests and letter writing, but also potentially boycotts, is for there to be public pressure on entities to at least outwardly give time to having invested interest in the environment. Okay, I'm realizing now that SpaceX is a glaring difference to this whole rule. I think that they are a law unto themselves, unfortunately. But so, I mean, that is one thing that I think we can think about, essentially soft power in conjunction with, again, regulatory oversight, but we have to think through the practicalities because, as Bruce mentioned, unfortunately, in law, people will look for loopholes. But again, that's not to say that it isn't something that I think we should pursue, but we need to do it practically in a way so that there is both buy-in and also, what's the word that I'm looking for, so that it's feasible and enforceable.
Thanks very much indeed. Right, now we're going to turn to Bruce for his answers, and that will be the final contribution. There are a lot of questions, though, keep on popping into the Q&A box that we haven't responded to. So Dave and Jill, I don't know if you want to have a look at those and see if you can respond to those questioners there. So Bruce, over to you now.
Okay, one of the questions to me was, what are the major threats due to all of this? I would say the first one is the desire for massive profits from the aerospace industry that is going to, we're already seeing it in my country, I don't know about others, but that's going to come out of the hides, if you will, of the people. It's going to come out of our social and environmental funding. So this is a huge threat. At the same time, I think going back to what I said earlier, in this vision for 2020 from the US Space Command, where they talk about controlling and dominating space, this is a major threat for my country with its allies, of which the UK is one of those allies, to believe that it has the right, 5% of the world's population, to control and dominate space. And now NATO is expanding into space, they claim, and they say they're going to be the guardians of the it's like how NATO always talks about they're the guardians of the waterways, the seaways, protecting international navigation of the seas. Well, now the US and NATO are talking about the same thing, that they're going to be the guardians of the highways in space. Well, again, this is quite provocative and outrageous. So I want to talk about the issue of falling debris, space debris that falls back to Earth, burns up on re-entry. I've read several scientists talking about how this stuff, a lot of times, as it burns up, it's computers, it's made with various technologies, that are made from various elements that are toxic in and of themselves. And when these things burn up and become dust and are spread across the world, it becomes a toxic soup. And so as we have more and more and more space debris orbiting the Earth, it's a danger already just being up there. But to start to say that, well, it's better if we get more of it to fall back to Earth because then we've helped alleviate some of the space debris problem, orbiting the Earth. Well, it's still a problem on some level. And I'm not an expert to say how much of a level, but it sounds to me like it's quite a bit of a level enough. On the question of anti-satellite tests, India, Russia, China, and the United States. I don't know of anyone else. Dave, you might know if I'm wrong on that, if there's anyone else that have tested anti-satellite weapons. But at this point, at least those 4 countries have. The United States made a big announcement last week that it won't be doing any more anti-satellite tests. And I noticed the Russians were quick to challenge that, saying, well, the reason why they're making this announcement is because they've completed all of their anti-satellite testing. They're satisfied with what they have. So anyway, there's still controversy whether people are testing or not. There's still controversy about the existence of anti-satellite weapons. And because of space debris, the old idea of going up and blowing up satellites is beginning to fade away. And that's why we see more and more talk about cyber warfare, the ability to essentially take your computer and crawl inside of another country's computer technology, their satellite, and shut it down, just shut it down. So as a war is just beginning to happen, country X can shut down country Y's capability to use their satellites to see what's happening to them, to be able to respond because of cyber technology. So cyber technology, something we haven't even really talked about here, is a real problem, adding more fuel to the fire.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed, Bruce. And well, that's almost dead on our end time. So thanks very much to everyone who did put in questions that we weren't able to answer on screen. But this has been the most incredibly interesting discussion, and I urge everyone to look at the new report which the speakers have been talking about. And of course, as I said, this webinar will be available to watch back and for you to share with friends and colleagues who have an interest in the subject. And of course, above all, let's get active campaigning to prevent these terrible things happening. So a huge thank you to our speakers. We really appreciate you joining us this evening, and thank you very much to you, the audience. Have a lovely evening.